Boy, do I have an insane story for you guys. As I'm recording this, it appears the Trump White House, the State Department, and the CIA are in the middle of a coup to overthrow Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. For those of you who don't know, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on the planet. That's an important fact to keep in mind because by the end of the segment, it's going to be very clear that this is not an attempt to restore democracy in Venezuela or any other bullshit justification coming from the Trump administration. In reality, it's a brazen attempt to let U.S. oil companies like Exxon raid Venezuela for their natural resources, as has been the case many times throughout history. I've been following the economic and political crisis in Venezuela on and off for the last few years, a lot more closely since Trump's been president, because multiple times, very early on in his presidency, he's made very outlandish remarks alluding to the possibility of illegal U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. The United States has a long and very well documented history of interfering in the domestic policies of foreign governments. When the U.S. wants regime change in a country, come hell or high water, the U.S. will almost definitely find a way to make it happen. So to see Trump as president so openly and aggressively promote the option of a coup in Venezuela raised a lot of red flags for me. Just this week, tensions have escalated quickly in the country. To be very clear, I'm not a defender of Maduro. In my personal opinion, I wouldn't be shocked if I found out that he was corrupt. That said, even if he was corrupt, and some of the reporting is true, it in no way justifies the action of the U.S. government and all other actors involved to try to illegally overthrow the official government by way of a coup. Now let me get into the specifics of the situation unfolding on the ground that have confirmed to everyone paying attention that the U.S. is orchestrating regime change in Venezuela. The main claim that the U.S. government is using in order to justify their actions in Venezuela are the recently held election that some have contested were rigged by Maduro. I'll get back to that point later on in the segment so I can break down the absurdity and highlight the irony of that justification. 2 days ago, the leader of the National Assembly, Juan Guiado, which is comparable to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, here in the United States, came out in the middle of the streets of Venezuela and declared himself the official president of the country. Up until a few weeks ago, when he was elected the leader of the National Assembly, no one in Venezuela knew who he was, which raises a lot of questions as to why he would think he'd have the authority to just declare himself president of the entire country. Then almost immediately after his announcements in the streets of Venezuela, Donald Trump came out and recognized him as the official president of the country, and also said that the Maduro government is illegitimate. This is already a massive violation of international norms. Because under international law, it's illegal for any country to stage or support illegal coups in another sovereign country. This is an extremely important part of international law because historically, the United States government and other powerful countries around the world are known for supporting rebels and separatist movements to overthrow governments who oppose them on policy and ideology. But Trump's statement raised even more red flags because of the timing. It was almost immediately after Guaido's announcement that he declared himself the president, that Trump comes out and also says that he's a legitimate president of Venezuela. So again, it seems fairly obvious that the United States is coordinating with the opposition in Venezuela to overthrow the legitimate government. Another worrying sign that this situation is going to continue to escalate is that foreign governments around the world are backing the U.S. move to declare Guaido the official president of Venezuela. A few of those governments are neighboring countries like Colombia and Argentina, as well as the entire European Union. Clearly, I see this entire situation as a brazen attempt to undermine international law and undermine the sovereignty of another country by effectively deciding who the leader of that country is going to be. Now, I want to give you guys some of the statements from the Trump administration so you can see for yourself how much they're itching for regime change in Venezuela. This is a quote from Trump back in 2017. Quote, "We have many options for Venezuela, and by the way, I'm not going to rule out the military option." Another quote from 2017 from Trump. These are Trump's direct words, so it's going to sound like I'm botching the quote, but no, he just really sounds stupid. Quote, "We're all over the world, and we have troops all over the world, and in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away, and the people are suffering and dying. We have many options for Venezuela, including a possible military option if necessary," end quote. Now, this is Vice President Mike Pence in 2017. Quote, "We're simply not going to tolerate seeing Venezuela collapse into a dictatorship," end quote. So Mike Pence, what the fuck are you going to do, huh? What the fuck are you going to do? Like, I'm just so tired of the American exceptionalism. The idea that any adult person in this country can really hold this idea in their mind that the United States has a right to just militarily intervene in the country when we feel like they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing is fucking absurd, and it's led to countless military interventions and genocides around the world. Unnecessarily. Now, this is a quote from Mike Pompeo just a couple of days ago. Quote, "The time for debate is done," end quote. Every single one of those quotes were public statement. Those comments are so straightforward and straight to the point, I almost can't even provide commentary or analysis on them. The administration's position on Venezuela from day one has been, we're looking for every and any excuse to do regime change in the country. We're going to skip the pretenses, we're going to skip the fake diplomacy, and the official position is we want Maduro out of office. Again, those were just a few of their public statements. Now, some naive and gullible people might respond by saying, well, that's just them talking tough. They're not actually really going to do anything. So let me give you some insights into what's actually happening behind the scenes of the Trump administration in regards to Venezuela. So last year, there was a huge story from government officials about Trump specifically pushing to invade Venezuela. So he was at a dinner with Latin American leaders and their staffs. Before the dinner even started, Trump's aides told him not to bring up military intervention in Venezuela because that might make some people in the room very uncomfortable. This is a quote from Trump at that same dinner. Quote, "My staff, they told me not to say this, but..." Then he proceeded to go around the table and ask Latin American leaders if they were sure that they didn't want military intervention in Venezuela. Before I get into the more serious angle of this, I just want to get the petty stuff out of the way. That quote is quintessential Donald Trump. He's such a fucking simpleton and prone to say idiotic things. His staff knows this, which is why they tried to tell him before the dinner, hey, just don't bring up the Venezuela shit, just leave it, because you're just gonna botch it and make yourself look like an idiot. But of course, Trump can't help himself, and he does the exact opposite of what everybody tells him to do. The other thing that got me was how flippantly he just asked world leaders if they want to do a military intervention. He brings it up like he's going to the fucking corner store. Hey, I'm just going to run to the store real quick. Do you need anything? Doritos, beers, military intervention. Anyone need me to pick up some military intervention for them? Anybody? No? But seriously, this is how flippantly they talk about military intervention. Completely disregarding the fact that hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, could die if a hot war were to break out in Venezuela. Create millions of refugees. These are some bad, more actions being taken behind the scenes. Back in 2017, when Mike Pompeo was a CIA director for Donald Trump, he was at a security conference and he was doing a question and answer session with some people in the audience. And I have some damning quotes from that session. Quote, "I'm hopeful that there can be a transition in Venezuela and the CIA is doing its best." Allow me to break down that bullshit and put it in some normal language for you. What he's saying is the CIA officially wants there to be regime change and a transition to a government that will let the U.S. interests do whatever they want in the country. That's not me reading too much into the quote or me making shit up. In context of the whole situation, the actors involved, and the history the CIA has of staging coups in Latin American countries, the interpretation I just gave is the only logical interpretation you can make of that quote. If you don't believe that's what he means, he continues, quote, "I was just down in Mexico City and Bogota a week before last talking about this very issue, trying to help them understand the things that they might do so they can get a better outcome for their part of the world and our part of the world." What he's saying in that quote is the CIA is already orchestrating a plan to conduct regime change. So if Mexico and Colombia want a seat at the table, they better play ball with the U.S. Then when it's all over and the CIA installs a puppet to replace Maduro, we'll all sit back and split the profits. Mike Pompeo is without question one of the most disgusting, bloodthirsty warmongers in the Trump administration. How fucking gross is that? He's really trying to play kingmaker to raid Venezuela and split the rewards with his fellow war criminals. It's truly disgusting. He doesn't even attempt to mask his imperialistic tendencies. If their intentions aren't clear enough yet, I have more evidence that we're actively staging a coup. Just yesterday, as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the administration will officially be bringing on Elliott Abrams. This is a quote from Mike Pompeo on the hiring of Elliott Abrams. Quote, "He will have responsibility for all things related to our effort to restore democracy in Venezuela." First, for those of you who don't know, Abrams was part of the Reagan administration. As it relates to this topic, he played an undisclosed role in the Iran-Contra scandal, where the Reagan administration was caught illegally selling weapons to Iran to fund terrorists, the Contra rebels, so that they can stage a coup to overthrow the Sandinistan government of Nicaragua at the time. And just look at how Mike Pompeo describes his new role. Quote, he will have responsibility for all things related to our efforts to restore democracy in Venezuela. To restore democracy in Venezuela. Restoring democracy in the context of U.S. foreign policy is literally interchangeable with regime change. They mean the exact same thing. Also, if the U.S. wasn't working a coup, you wouldn't need to have someone overseeing an operation to restore democracy, because that's an internal domestic issue that the people of Venezuela themselves would have to handle and figure out. Furthermore, if you were staging a coup in a Latin American country, there would be almost no one better you can hire to oversee the operation than Abrams. Abrams has experience funding rebels and terrorists to stage coups like he did in Nicaragua and in El Salvador. And he also has experience propping up strongman authoritarian dictators in Latin American countries who do the bidding of the U.S. interests. I'm sure there are some people who will see this segment, even after all the evidence, and wonder how it can be so sure that the U.S. is staging a coup. To that I say, this isn't the first time this has happened. Not even close. U.S. foreign policy since the beginning of the country has been marked with an endless list of unnecessary military interventions. The example that always comes to mind is the CIA coup of the Ecuadorian government in the 1950s, and I implore everyone to go research that event. It's obvious to anyone paying attention that the U.S. largely wages wars to jack natural resources. At the very beginning, I touched on the bullshit justification that they were giving, so now I want to explain exactly how it's bullshit. I find it amazing that at this late date, grown-ass adult people still believe that the U.S. would interfere in another country, in this case Venezuela, to defend democracy and freedom and free and fair elections. If you lived through and were just a casual observer of politics during Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Vietnam, and you believe that the United States goes to war all the time, most of the time, or even some of the time, to defend human rights and democracy, you're a fucking rube. You're a sucker. You're not a very bright person. I've spoken about these military interventions on the show before and gone into detail about how terrible of an idea they all were and have all had disastrous consequences. Massive civilian casualties, instability throughout the country. I won't get into all of that right now in this video, but some statistics and facts to be aware of that immediately disprove the notion that the United States government wages regime change wars and does military intervention to defend democracy and free and fair elections and human rights or any of that bullshit. Right now as we speak, the U.S. currently arms and backs 73% of all the world's dictatorships. Let's just bask in the irony of that for just a moment. Right now, the neocons are literally in the middle of a coup to overthrow Maduro. The main justification that they're giving is that they believe that he rigged his recent election. You know who else rigs their elections? All the dictators in the world. 73% of them the U.S. currently arms and backs financially. I have a small recommendation for Trump and the neocons. If you're so concerned about free and fair elections, stop supporting people who arrest and murder their political opponents. You know, people like the Saudi royal family. Among all the other nasty, horrendous adjectives you'd like to use to describe the Saudi royal family, they are also a monarchy. So they don't even bother having elections to rig them. They skip all that pretense and just hand over control of the country within the family. I can also get into some of the other countries around the world that we do business with who also rig their elections. Erdogan of Turkey, who's been switching from prime minister to president, rigging his own elections for the last 20 years, I believe. The same goes for Vladimir Putin in Russia. He rigs his elections all the time. He rigged his last election. I also haven't even brought up the widespread election fraud that happens in the United States on a yearly basis. With voter suppression, you have people like Secretary of State Brian Kemp in Georgia, Secretary of State Chris Kobach of Kansas, who got to oversee their own election because they were the Secretary of State. So in state governments, that position means you get to oversee all the elections in the state. And they use it to their advantage to rig the election in their favors. Both of them have credible allegations of them rigging the election. Brian Kemp took hundreds of thousands of African American people off the voter rolls in Georgia because they were likely to vote for Stacey Abrams. We have the Electoral College in the last 2 out of 5 elections that we've had handed over the presidency to the person who lost the popular vote, Donald Trump in 2016 and George Bush in 2000. This turned into a long-winded version of me saying, before you clutch your pearls and shed your crocodile tears over Maduro allegedly rigging his election, my suggestion is that the U.S. government should get their house in order first. One broader point I'd like to make about the topic of U.S. military intervention. These are the exact kind of situations that the anti-interventionists and the anti-war movement in the United States try to warn people about and prevent all the time. Whenever anybody brings up the military-industrial complex and how the U.S. has a track record a mile long of overthrowing governments to steal their natural resources for the benefit of U.S. corporations, everyone in the media establishment, the political establishment, they'll all call you conspiratorial and they won't take you seriously. Or when you call people like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, Donald Trump, when you call all these neocons warmongers, everyone in the establishment clutches their pearls over that. Oh, how dare you call someone of polite society a warmonger? These are civil servants working to protect and defend the country. Have you no shame? Anytime they hear someone use the term warmonger, they take that as some type of below-the-belt, tacky, classless personal attack. But when people on the left make that criticism, it's almost always coming from an objective analysis of the person's policies. If for your entire career you've advocated for more U.S. interventions in more countries, despite the fact that the results are always the same, thousands of civilian deaths, complete collapse of the country's infrastructure as well as the country's government, a huge migration crisis, rampant corruption in whatever government decides to take control of the country after we've overthrown the first government. If after seeing those results for your entire career and your position still is, let's do more military intervention, let's stay in all these endless wars that we're currently involved in, well then the term warmonger perfectly describes you. It's a dictionary term. Quote, this is from the dictionary, a person who encourages or advocates aggression towards other countries or groups. That's what's in the dictionary. Now let me ask you a question. How many times have you ever heard an anchor, host, reporter, commentator on the mainstream media, CNN, ABC, MSNBC, CBS, any of those networks? When was the last time you ever heard them use the word warmonger? It's not like we have any shortage of them in the United States or around the world. They're in the news all the time. People like Lindsey Graham, one of the biggest neocons in the Senate, or Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton. To the mainstream media, calling someone a warmonger, even though it was factually, objectively, an accurate description of that person, it's just considered off limits. Like I mentioned, they consider it a tacky personal attack. At some point, they might call someone a war hawk or, a nice little euphemism. They might say they're a little hawkish. By the way, I love the cute little words that they use to describe people who relentlessly advocate for genocide and endless war. But you would never hear any of them being called a warmonger. That just shows their establishment bias and how they worship institutions like the military and the CIA and the FBI and the State Department, as well as anyone in high-level positions at those departments and agencies who are objectively doing a bad job. The events that have taken place recently have made clear Trump and the United States government intention of orchestrating a coup in Venezuela. The story is extremely nuanced and there are no good guys in any of this. I will be following this closely, but as of now, the situation is not looking good. It does look extremely likely that there will be an attempted coup of Maduro in the very near future. I don't know how far the U.S. military will go to back Guiado, but it does go without saying I think we should not be involved in Venezuela's domestic affairs at all.